Welcome to the deep dive. So our mission today is something like historical alchemy. We've got this huge stack of sources in front of us covering 4 really different historical worlds. We're talking nearly 5,000 years spanned here. And what we're going to do is try and pull out the most, well, surprising bits. The resilience, the ambition, the sheer ingenuity people showed under, extreme pressure. We're not really following a strict timeline today. It's more about themes of survival, maybe ambition too. Our deep dive is going to take you from these smoky, dirt-floored huts in medieval Europe, places where life literally depended on keeping a single ember alive. Then we'll jump to the, gilded cages, you could say, of the Tudor court. High stakes, lots of treachery. After that, we pivot, go across the Atlantic, colonial America, right in the middle of this political pressure cooker. And then we swing way back, thousands of years back, to Peru, to these silent, really sophisticated pyramids that most people have never heard of. Okay, so here's the plan, the path we're taking. First, we're going to get, frankly, uncomfortably cold.
We're looking at the brutal, clever ways medieval peasants survived winter, just making it through. Second, we'll dig into Anne Boleyn, her political maneuvering, her ambition, and her spectacular engineered downfall, a woman who really did change England. Third, we shift to the Boston Tea Party, that moment where principle just completely overshadowed price. High stakes, big decision. Finally, we're going to challenge some basic assumptions about civilization itself. We'll explore the mystery of Kral, this peaceful ancient city in Peru, older than Giza's pyramids. Okay, let's get started. Let's unpack this journey. Right, segment 1, medieval resilience. Surviving that merciless winter. Let's start by picturing a scene. A European peasant hut, dead of winter. Let's say, around 1400 AD. You really need to forget any romantic ideas you might have, crackling fires, festive cheer, that stuff. For your average person back then, winter wasn't a season of joy. It was this annual, terrifying test of endurance. Pure and simple, the goal, survive. Survive until spring without starving, freezing to death, or getting pneumonia. That was it. And the core problem, it wasn't just the weather outside. It was the house itself. Most homes were tiny, usually just one room. And they were built using something called wattle-and-daub. Sounds a bit fancy, maybe. It wasn't. Wattle is basically woven sticks, like a rough basket structure for the walls. And daub, that's the plaster they slapped on to fill the gaps. It was a mix of clay, mud, straw. And this is crucial, animal dung. Dung. It acted as a binder, made it sticky, and gave a tiny bit of crude insulation. But look, no matter how well you plastered it, that house was really fragile shell against the elements. Our sources, they describe these walls as, and I quote, enthusiastic wind tunnels. Plus, depending on where you were, the air inside was damp, heavy. The temperature inside, often just a couple of degrees warmer than outside. Barely. So stepping inside wasn't about getting warm. It was just about getting less freezing. And the floor, often just packed earth, compacted dirt or clay, which meant the cold just seeped up from below, relentless, like this grim underground entity you couldn't escape. So what do? They slept on sacks. Sacks filled with hay or straw. Minimal insulation, really. And bonus points, a great home for fleas and other vermin. So every night was a gamble. A constant fight against losing he who was grim. Beyond the wind and the cold, though, the construction itself posed other problems. More insidious ones. Maintenance, for one, and pests. These walls, the thatched roofs, usually reeds or straw, they needed constant fixing. The smoke inside, which we'll get to, actually eroded the thatch pretty quickly. And if you didn't maintain the roof, moisture gets in, rot starts. And it becomes a nice home for rats, mice, disease carriers. So living in these places meant this constant low-level crisis, structural integrity, hygiene, always on the edge. Okay, so if the house was the problem, the hearth, or the fireplace, that was the solution. It was absolutely the center of life in that hut. Kitchen, light source, and even a crude form of pest control. See, most peasant homes didn't have chimneys. Those are expensive, complicated to build. So the smoke from the fire didn't go up and out nicely. It just drifted. It would find its way out through maybe a hole cut in the roof, but more often, it just hung low, coated everything. Walls, people, lungs, and soot. The health cost was obviously high. Chronic lung problems were common. But there was an immediate benefit, a vital one. The smoke acted like a fumigator. It kept the insects down somewhat, especially fleas, which carry disease. So peasants were basically, slow smoking themselves and everything they owned, trading long-term health for immediate survival from bugs and the cold. Now, the number one mandatory duty for everyone in the family, keep that fire alive. Letting it die wasn't just inconvenient. It could literally mean death. Remember, no matches, no lighters for centuries. Reigniting a fire meant this desperate struggle, flint, steel, tender, in the freezing dark, with numb fingers, often futile. This difficulty. It turned firebanking into this absolutely crucial survival skill, passed down generation to generation. Firebanking. It's like the ancient thermodynamics of just staying alive. Before sleep, you'd carefully gather the glowing embers, then bury them under this deep mound of ash. Ash, surprisingly, is a fantastic insulator. It traps the heat, but also stars the embers of oxygen, just enough. Keeps them barely alive, smoldering, sort of suspended animation. And the technique had to be precise. Enough ash to insulate, but not so much you smother the heat completely. You also had to know your wood. Which ones made the best coals, the longest lasting ones? Hardwoods like oak, much better than pine or birch. Then morning comes. First job, poke the ash pile. Gently uncover those coals. Blow softly. Add tiny bits of kindling. Coax it back to life. Get that process wrong, you lose the fire. And the family plunges into cold, dark, dangerous territory. So their homes offered minimal insulation. What else could they do? Well, they turned to strategic body heat. Human contact became pure survival math. This wasn't about affection, really. It was about maximizing communal warmth. Thermal efficiency, the tactic. One source calls it the snoring human lasagna. A bit grim, maybe, but accurate. The whole family, sometimes even neighbors if things got really bad, would pile together. Warmest corner, usually near the hearth, sharing whatever ragged blankets they had and just body warmth. And this wasn't random piling. It was strategic. The strongest, warmest people. They slept on the outside, like human shields against the drafts seeping through the wattle-and-daub. The babies, the frail elderly, tucked deep in the middle, treated almost like precious little heat generators, benefiting from everyone else's warmth. This clustering, it wasn't just practical for warmth. Think about those long, dark winter weeks. It was probably the core psychological unit of survival, too. Huddled together against the dark and cold. And then there were the other housemates, the livestock, bringing cows, goats, pigs, chickens inside the hut, absolutely non-negotiable for many. These animals weren't just food or wealth on legs, they were vital. Chaotic, yes, but vital living furnaces. They generated significant body heat, could raise the hut's temperature by a few crucial degrees. The smells, though, our sources say they were legendary. This pungent, overwhelming mix. Smoke, unwashed humans, animal waste. All in one small enclosed space. But peasants, they developed a selective sense of smell. Survival trumped comfort, every time. And this cohabitation, it was also layered with economic sense. Kept the animals safe from predators, safe from theft. Protected the family's main assets through the winter. Plus, sometimes the animal waste itself was collected, dried, and used as fuel. Right there inside the home. Connects the whole cycle, doesn't it? Heat, wealth, waste management, all in this one desperate loop. Yeah, sharing your living room with a cow definitely had hazards. Stepping in something, unavoidable. Getting a chicken roosting on your head while you slept. Apparently it happened. But that extra warmth, often the difference between life and death. Okay, final layer of defense. Clothing and, cleanliness, or the lack thereof. Layering was obviously key. Peasants wore every scrap of clothing they owned. Rough spun wool tunics, maybe a goat-smelling cloak if they were lucky. They looked, as one source rightly put it, like lumpy laundry bags. But here's where the survival hack gets really interesting. Tactical grime. Washing clothes in winter. Nearly impossible. You'd risk freezing while waiting days for that thick, damp wool to maybe dry. So to do it, the natural body oils, the grease from cooking, and animals, it all built up. And this wasn't just poor hygiene, it was strategic. This grimy layer clogged the gaps in the wool fibers, made the clothes wind-resistant, water-resistant to a degree. It acted like a kind of medieval Gore-Tex jacket, smellier, absolutely, but effective against heat loss. This protective holy filth barrier, as someone called it, was tolerated, maybe even cultivated, because clean clothes breathe, and breathable clothes in that cold, deadly. Having a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you were basically winning at winter survival. And finally, there were these subtle, almost scientific hacks they employed, like survival breathing. They learned to take shallow, slow breaths, only through the nose. Why? To warm the air gently before it hit the lungs. Deep, open-mouth breaths, that brought frigid air straight in, increased the risk of lung infections, pneumonia, which killed faster than hunger sometimes. They also mastered some basic thermodynamics through diet. Simple strategy. Eat heavy, right before bed. Big, starchy, high-fat meals. Stews made from turnips, barley, maybe some rye bread, lard if you had it. This huge, dense meal would sit in the gut, take hours to digest. And that metabolic process, breaking down the food, it generated internal body heat, an internal furnace powered by gruel, basically. Lasted to the coldest part of the night. And lastly, primitive heating pads. Localized comfort. They used hay boxes, wooden boxes lined with hay for insulation, sometimes to keep food warm, sometimes maybe even people's feet. And crucially, heated stones. Flat, smooth stones, roasted in the hearth until almost too hot to touch, then wrapped carefully in rags, slipped into the straw bedding. This provided this localized, precious warmth against the cold, damp earth. Often lasted for hours. A tiny bit of engineering brilliance, born from just absolute necessity. Okay, let's shift gears now. We move from that raw, physical survival against nature to a fight that's different, but just as desperate in its own way, the struggle for political survival. In the gilded but treacherous world of the Tudor court, segment 2. Tudor turmoil, Anne Boleyn's high-stakes game. Anne Boleyn, born around maybe 1501, she was never destined to be just a footnote in Henry VIII's list of wives. She was an individual, magnetic ambition, sharp intellect, and she fundamentally reshaped England forever. Right from the start, she was different. Not conventionally beautiful, not by the pale, modest English standards of the time anyway, but descriptions call her clever, spirited, magnetic, dark, striking eyes. A fierce intelligence that just captivated people. Her real education, though, her finishing school, it wasn't in England. It was on the continent. She was sent abroad. First to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands. Very sophisticated place. Then, crucially, she spent years in France with Queen Claude and later Queen Marguerite of Navarre. Now, this was the powerhouse training ground for power. Think about it. The English court under Catherine of Aragon. Pious, politically conservative, maybe a little staid. The French court. Vibrant, center of intellectual life, high fashion, ruthless political maneuvering. Anne mastered languages, wit, dance, courtly intrigue. She learned how to command attention, not just with looks, but with her mind. So when she came back to England around 1522, she was like a phenomenon, a thunderstorm, one source calls her. Compared to the more reserved English ladies, she stood out. So when Anne caught Henry VIII's eye, she played one of the most audacious gambits in political history. Seriously, Henry was king. Used to getting whatever he wanted, he offered Anne the top spot, unofficially speaking. Royal mistress, you expected her to say yes. Anne's response, astonishing, an outright refusal. She demanded marriage. The crown, nothing less. Think about how audacious this was. It stunned Europe. Henry was married. To Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spanish royalty, and to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe at the time. To give Anne what she wanted, Henry would have to risk war, break centuries of tradition, defy the Pope himself. Anne didn't back down. She understood, probably, that being a mistress meant being temporary, discarded eventually. By demanding marriage, she forced Henry's hand, leveraged his obsession, his infatuation to the absolute limit, to the point where he's willing to drag an entire kingdom into religious schism, just for her. Incredible ambition. And Anne's gamble, it paid off. January 1533, they marry secretly. At a huge public coronation in June, she's crowned queen. And significantly, this ceremony used the special sacred oil normally reserved only for anointing kings, symbolically underlining her power, her status. But she entered that queenship not as a beloved figure, but as a storm. That's a quote. She was dazzling, yes, provocative, politically sharp, but she made powerful enemies, fast. And her position was always violently unstable. The ultimate cost of getting her that crown, the English Reformation, the break from Rome. Henry, helped by his chief minister Thomas Cromwell and the new Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, they spent years engineering the legal split. The Act of Supremacy gets passed, creates the Church of England, pretty much solely to secure Anne's position and get Henry the annulment Catherine wouldn't grant. The consequences were massive, religiously, obviously, but economically too. The break triggered the dissolution of the monasteries. This huge seizure of church lands poured immense wealth into the crown's pockets, cemented Henry's power, rewarded Anne's allies, many of whom leaned Protestant. But everything rested on one single, crushing expectation, producing a male heir. The birth of Elizabeth in September 1533. Huge for England's future, we know that now. But for Henry, a crushing disappointment. He needed a son. This was followed by multiple miscarriages for Anne, weakened her physically but also politically, massively. With each lost pregnancy, her enemies grew bolder. They knew her power depended entirely on her fertility, and it seemed to be failing. The fall, when it came, was precipitous, fast. Henry's affections, notoriously fickle, started wandering towards Jane Seymour. Softer, more compliant, the opposite of Anne, really. Henry had grown tired of Anne's sharp wit, her defiance, the very things that drew him in initially. Irony, right. Anne's enemies saw their chance, led by the ultimate political operator, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, remember, had been Anne's close ally, helped her rise now. He orchestrates her downfall. He realized Henry didn't want another messy divorce like with Catherine. He needed a clean break, a definitive exit. The solution Cromwell offered, removal. Through disgrace and execution, the accusations leveled against Anne in 1536, wild, monstrous, contradictory, adultery with 5 men, prominent courtiers, Weston, Norris, Brereton, even the court musician, Mark Smeaton, and incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. These charges weren't about finding truth. They were designed for a public unmaking, a ritual destruction of her reputation and life. The court twisted every casual flirtation, every innocent conversation into high treason, the most damning evidence. It came from Mark Smeaton. He was likely tortured intensely until he confessed, became the weak link they needed to condemn the others. And that charge of incest with her brother George, it wasn't just salacious gossip, it was legally essential. By accusing her of conspiring with her brother, they tied the alleged adultery directly to the royal succession. That turned her supposed sexual misconduct into high treason against the king and the realm. That allowed for her execution, bypassing the complexities of another annulment or divorce. Clever and utterly ruthless. Anne's final act, though, was one of striking dignity. At her trial, held in the Tower of London, she defended herself, with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure. That's how it's described. She denied every charge, clearly logically. The verdict was predetermined. Guilty. Facing execution, Henry granted her one small mercy, if you can call it that. He imported a master swordsman from Calais, France. A sword was considered quicker, cleaner, maybe more noble than the typical English executioner's axe. Anne comforted her distraught ladies-in-waiting. Faced the scaffold on May 19, 1536. Her final public speech was careful. She praised the king, prayed for his prosperity. Didn't want him punishing her family further. Her life ended quickly. Buried in an unmarked grave within the tower, seemingly erased. But her legacy, untouchable really, it blazed through her daughter, Elizabeth II, who inherited, they say, Anne's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn, through her life, her ambition, her death, she dragged England, kicking and screaming maybe into a new era. Made her one of the most consequential figures of the whole Tudor period. Okay, let's shift again. From the high-stakes personal ambition of a queen to the collective power of political principle, of resistance, we're moving across the Atlantic now to the American colonies, mid-18th century. Segment 3, Principle over Price, the Boston Tea Party. By the 1770s, the American colonies were just a pressure cooker of resentment towards British rule. The stage for the Boston Tea Party was set years before by things like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, policies the colonists deeply resented. The central issue, the absolute core violation they felt, it crystallized in that famous phrase, taxation without representation. It's fascinating, though, about the lead-up to the Tea Party, is just how purely political the motivation was. The taxes themselves, on tea, especially after the New Act, were actually modest, even made the tea cheaper in some ways. If this had been purely about money, about economics, the colonists probably would have just grumbled, bought the cheap tea, and moved on. But the fury was entirely about principle. Accepting any tax levied by a parliament where they had no elected voice, that meant accepting they were just subjects, distant possessions, not citizens with rights. To accept the tax, no matter how tiny, that felt like surrendering liberty itself. So in 1773, Parliament makes this critical miscalculation, the Tea Act. Now, this law wasn't really designed primarily to squeeze more tax money out of the colonists. It was designed as a bailout, a rescue mission for the British East India Company. The EIC was this huge financial giant, critical to Britain's global economy, but it was floundering badly, had this massive surplus of unsold tea, millions of pounds just rotting in London warehouses, threatening to bankrupt the company, huge debts. So the Tea Act allowed the EIC to sell its tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants, cutting out the middlemen. This made the tea significantly cheaper for American consumers, even cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea, which was common. But the colonists saw right through it. They recognized this bargain as a sophisticated trap. Accepting the cheap tea meant implicitly accepting Parliament's right to tax them, and Parliament's right to use them as an economic tool to prop up a favored corporation. To the Sons of Liberty, figures like Samuel Adams. There was unthinkable, that's the word used. It became a test of their commitment to principle. And they weren't going to fold just to save a few pence on tea. The situation really came to a head in Boston Harbor. 3 EIC ships arrived, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, carrying the controversial tea, and they got trapped. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, the king's man in Massachusetts, refused to let the ships leave without unloading the tea and paying the duty. The Sons of Liberty, backed by the people of Boston, refused to let them unload it. So you get this tense standoff, the political deadlock, like a bowstring pulled tighter and tighter each day. What made the situation really explosive was the ticking clock. British customs law was clear. Cargo had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If that deadline passed, customs officials had the legal right to seize the cargo, sell it themselves, and collect the tax by force. Once that tax was paid, even under duress, the principle was lost. The point was conceded. December 16, 1773. Thousands of colonists crammed into the Old South Meeting House in Boston, desperately trying to find a legal way out. Then the grim news arrived. Governor Hutchinson wouldn't budge. The ships wouldn't be allowed to leave. The midnight deadline was approaching. That's when Samuel Adams, the kind of iron voice of rebellion, stood up, and he delivered the signal. Clear, definitive words. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. That was the cue. The trigger. Men, some with their faces blackened with soot, wearing these crude mohawk disguises, they moved swiftly, silently towards Griffin's Wharf, where the ships were docked. The disguises, by the way, weren't really about fooling anyone. They were symbolic, representing this adoption of a new, defiant identity, shedding their status as British subjects to perform this act of resistance. What happened next was an act of cold, deliberate, almost surgical defiance. It was explicitly not a riot. This point is crucial. It was a calm, ruthless mission. The discipline shown by the men involved, extraordinary, speaks volumes about their political intent. They swarmed the ships, armed with hatchets mostly, and they targeted one thing and one thing only, the tea. Methodically, they smashed open 342 chests, dumped it all into the harbor. The financial loss was staggering, over 10,000 British pounds back then, a monumental sum. But crucially, nothing else was damaged or stolen. They reportedly even replaced a padlock they'd broken on one ship, swept the decks clean of stray tea leaves afterwards. They were meticulous, making it clear this was about principle, not about looting or personal gain. The aftermath was, well, visceral. The harbor literally became a great swirling teapot. The town woke up the next morning to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. The news split opinions across the colonies, of course, but figures like John Adams immediately saw its historical weight, called it monumental, world-changing, a necessary act of defiant liberty. The most immediate and perhaps most significant consequence of the Tea Party, the massive blowback from London. Parliament wasn't just angry, they were humiliated. They saw it as an open, mocking challenge to their supreme authority over the colonies, and they demanded punishment. Brutal punishment. The result? A series of laws passed quickly in 1774. Laws the colonists immediately dubbed the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, as Britain called them. These weren't designed to raise money, they were designed to crush Boston, to isolate it, to make an example of it. Key punishments included the Boston Port Act, close the harbor completely to all commerce, crippled the city's economy overnight. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of most of its self-governance, put it under direct royal, essentially military control. And the Quartering Act was strengthened, forcing colonists to house British troops, highly inflammatory. Now, Parliament intended these harsh measures to make Boston a martyr city, frighten the other colonies into submission, isolate the troublemakers. But the effect, the exact opposite. The severity of the punishment outraged the other colonies. Instead of isolating Boston, it unified them. Suddenly, support poured into the besieged city. Wagon loads of supplies, food, money from Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Virginia, others. Colonists everywhere realized, if Parliament can do this to Boston, they can do it to us. By trying to punish one city, Britain unintentionally created a unified continent, welded the colonies together into this cohesive political front. This led directly to the convening of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, September 1774. The Tea Party didn't just reject a tax, it lit the spark, transformed a simmering colonial dispute into a full-blown continental rebellion. Okay, final transition. We're traveling now across centuries, across continents again, from the relatively recent fiery history of rebellion to the deep, silent past, to a place that challenges our basic assumptions about how human civilization even began. Segment 4, the peaceful pioneers, the mystery of Corral. Okay, imagine this. A sophisticated urban center, monumental architecture, complex social organization, thriving at the same time as the earliest cities in Mesopotamia, ancient Sumeria. And yet, it existed without the wheel, without metal tools, without any recognizable written language, and crucially, without any evidence of warfare. This was Corral. Corral was hidden, tucked away in the arid Supi Valley on the coast of Peru. For nearly 5,000 years, its massive ruins, the pyramids and plazas, they were just mistaken for natural hills, natural formations of the desert. The real revelation came fairly recently, late 20th century, led by a Peruvian archaeologist, Ruth Chady. Radiocarbon dating dropped a bombshell. Corral was over 4,600 years old. That makes it the oldest recognized urban center in the entire Americas, flourishing long before the Incas, or the Maya even, and contemporary with the early stages of pyramid building in Giza, Egypt. This was huge, because it proved complex urban life, monumental building. It rose in the Americas independently, completely separate from the old world developments, shattered older theories that complex societies only came much later over here, and they did it in this challenging environment, a desert valley that looks at first glance totally inhospitable. The ingenuity of the people of Corral, it lay in how they overcame that desert environment. They used simple but brilliant hydrological engineering, water management. They saw the Supi River, even though it's modest, as their lifeblood. And they figured out how to harness its seasonal flow. How? By building sophisticated gravity-fed canal systems. They dug channels that took water from the river far upstream, guided it carefully across the valley floor, turned patches of that unforgiving desert into a thriving oasis, capable of feeding a pretty substantial population. This wasn't just digging ditches, it was complex water management, required planning, understanding seasonal flows, maintaining a fragile ecological balance year after year. And what they achieved without is maybe even more remarkable. Their key crop wasn't just food like corn, though they grew that too. It was cotton, high-quality cotton. They spun this cotton into large, sturdy fishing nets, and these nets fueled a crucial trade network with villages right on the coast. They'd trade nets for dried fish, shells, other marine resources. So they mastered the desert through what? Patience, intellect, cooperation, network building, not through forced labor or military might. The architecture at Corral really speaks volumes about their society, their priorities. You see these massive structures dominating the site. Like the main pyramid, the Pyramid Mayor. It's huge, 450 feet long, nearly 60 feet high. But unlike Egyptian pyramids, Carol's pyramids were not tombs for kings. They seem to have been centers of ceremony, public life, astronomical observation, platforms for rituals, perhaps. Reflecting this focus on the cosmos, on shared community events, and how they built them is ingenious, especially given the lack of heavy tools or draft animals. They used a technique called the shikra method. This involved weaving these large bags out of reeds, the shikras, then filling them with loose rocks. These big bags of rock were then layered inside the pyramid structure like fill. Now, why is this brilliant? Carol is in a highly active earthquake zone, traditional rigid stone construction. It would have cracked and crumbled long ago under seismic stress. But the shikra bags, they created these flexible layered fills inside the mounds. They acted like natural shock absorbers, anti-seismic devices essentially. Allow the structures to shift, settle slightly during tremors without catastrophic collapse. This flexible sort of basket and rock technique is why these massive structures are still standing after nearly 5,000 years. Designing for resilience against natural disaster. Incredible foresight. But here is where the story of Corral gets really interesting. The absence of war. In all the extensive excavations done there, archaeologists have found no defensive walls, no fortifications, no weapons caches, no mass graves suggesting conflict. Nothing. This strongly suggests a society built not on force or conquest or keeping people down, but on cooperation, trade, and shared belief. That's the phrase researchers often use. They invested their immense collective energy not into armies or defenses, but into building these huge ceremonial centers, into music, into presumably a rich community life. How did they maintain social harmony without military control? Well, the economy itself seems to have been based on reciprocity. Mutual benefit. Trade was extensive, yes, connecting the coast, fish, shells, with the inland valley, cotton, gourds, beans. But the sources suggest these exchanges might have functioned more like ritual gift-giving or fulfilling mutual obligations rather than purely transactional, profit-driven deals, reinforcing social bonds. And ritual life seems absolutely central to holding it all together. Music was clearly vital. They found amazing collections of flutes made from condor bones, pelican bones, drums made from deer hides. Imagine the sounds filling those grand public spaces, those sunken circular plazas that look like ancient amphitheaters. These rituals, likely tied to agricultural cycles, astronomical events, they probably served to unite the community, replace the need for soldiers with shared tradition, shared belief. So after centuries of flourishing, Corral was abandoned, gradually, quietly. There are no signs of a big catastrophe, no fire, no conquest, no invasion that destroyed the city. It just faded. The people left. The mystery of exactly why still hangs over the valley. But the main theories point towards long-term environmental change. Failure, perhaps. A prolonged period of drought, maybe linked to climate shift like El Niño events, could have tipped that fragile ecological balance. Starved the fields, disrupted the river flow that their irrigation depended on. Another possibility. Shifting regional trade routes. Maybe new centers of power rose elsewhere, along the coast or further inland, diminishing Corral's central importance. Its influence just waned. Whatever the specific cause or combination of causes, the departure seems to have been gradual. Not sudden. Families just drifted away, perhaps, seeking new opportunities, greener valleys. And the great city, its pyramids and plazas were slowly, quietly reclaimed by the desert sands. It remained hidden, silent, for 4,000 years. Stand today as this incredible testament to the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. Such a powerful counter-narrative in history, isn't it? Proof that civilization can achieve monumental things, complexity, stability, without the usual story of warfare and coercion. Okay, let's wrap this up. We've covered 4 very different worlds today, defined by very different pressures. The sheer grit of medieval life, just clinging to a glowing ember through winter. The fire of Anne Boleyn's ambition, and the sophisticated political games needed to both elevate and destroy a queen. The overwhelming power of an idea, of political principle driving ordinary citizens to destroy a fortune in Boston Harbor, and the silent, sophisticated wisdom of Carl's founders, building a monumental civilization seemingly based on cooperation, not conflict. If we try to connect these, disparate threads, maybe the theme that emerges is something like foundational acts. Small actions, often taken under extreme pressure, that end up having these huge exponential consequences down the line. Think about it. Carefully banking ashes to survive one more night. A young woman refusing a king, demanding a crown instead. A group deciding to destroy property to protect an invisible ideal, liberty. Ancient engineers choosing flexible reed bags over rigid stone. History isn't just shaped by the grand battles or decrees. It's also shaped by these specific acts of ingenuity or defiance or resilience, things that might seem small or localized at the time, but ripple outwards across generations. We often measure greatness in history by conflict, right? Who won the war, who conquered the most land. But what if sometimes true success is measured differently, by the ability to endure, to innovate when you have almost nothing, to build complexity without resorting to force? Maybe reflect on that distinction. Which of these solutions we talked about, from tactical grime and heated stones, to refusing power unless it's absolute, to valuing principle over profit, to peaceful city planning using shikra bags, which of those might still hold the most valuable lessons for us, navigating the complex pressures of our own world today? We'll leave you with that thought to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with us today.